In the early 1800s, where this history begins, mental illness was largely defined by observations of unusual behavior. There was not a standardized diagnostic system or clear understanding of mental health. Because mental illness was thought to be moral and spiritual failings, punishment and shame were handed down not only to the mentally ill, but to the family as well. Women had no rights, therefore their husbands or fathers believed they had to be controlled. There were private madhouses for the rich to place their mentally ill, and workhouses for the poor. Often, individuals with mental illnesses were either homeless, placed in jails, or poorhouses. Asylums began to appear, but were merely places of confinement and not treatment centers. In 1821, the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum was established and was the second oldest public mental facility in the U.S. On Bull Street in Columbia, South Carolina, the first building built for this purpose was the Mills Building and is a National Historic Landmark today. Robert Mills, who designed the Washington monuments in both Baltimore and D.C., was the architect. The Mills Building is the oldest surviving state mental health structure in the U.S. and began admitting patients in 1828. However, it was only open to paying patients at first. Later, indigent patients were admitted, and their stay was billed to the government of the patient's home district. A patient paid $250 annually to stay there. It was an additional $100 annually for a separate room and eating area. Paupers were admitted for $135 annually, and the fee was paid by the home district. Mostly paupers were admitted over time, and the fees were harder to collect with the influx. Men and women were originally housed on separate floors of the Mills Building. Later, males were placed in a separate building, and the Mills Building housed only female patients. As the number of patients rose, the original building had to be expanded, and new buildings were added. Treatment of these people was harsh and cruel, as they were placed in chains, manacles, given ice baths, mummified in a wrapped pack, put in straitjackets, waistcoats, or leather wristlets. Doctors claimed it kept the mentally ill person safe, but the restraints were more to control the overcrowded conditions. Common practices of the doctors were to reduce symptoms from bloodletting, inducing vomiting, and confinement to dark rooms. Progress toward understanding the psychology behind mental illness was slow. In 1865, the asylum on Bull Street also served as a POW camp. It became a refuge for Columbia residents when the city burned during Sherman's occupation. The asylum struggled to survive, and the superintendent, Dr. John Parker, often used his own money to buy food and necessities. In these early days, they did not actually treat patients. It was mostly a dorm for the mentally ill. Staff numbers were even cut so they could buy food and meet other needs. You can see how crammed they were. In 1874, they were able to add central heating, plumbing, new furniture, pianos, and books through private donations. In 1892, they opened a nursing school, which was closed in 1950. In 1896, it was renamed the South Carolina State Hospital for the Insane. A second campus was opened for African Americans north of Columbia and named the Palmetto State Hospital, but later renamed Crafts Faro Hospital, which is still used today. By 1900, they had 1,040 patients, with 30% of them dying annually. Causes were unsanitary living conditions and inadequate supervision. Some patients slept in the corridors for lack of adequate rooms and beds. Black and white patients were initially buried in the same cemetery located near the asylum, known as the Elmwood Lot. Once it filled up, they used a cemetery north of the Confederate Veterans Home or used the Columbia Pauper Cemetery for the whites. It is estimated that between 2,000 and 3,500 African Americans are buried in a historic cemetery plot on Sly's Avenue at the far edge of the hospital property. This area was used until 1922. By 1930, a different cemetery for black patients opened at State Park, the hospital asylum established north of the city just for African Americans. By 1960, they had admitted their 20,000th patient. Patients were sometimes just dropped off at the hospital by families who never returned for them even when they died. Epidemics of pellagra and TB, along with a growing indigent population, cemented the hospital's role as a custodial facility. By this time, physicians worked to differentiate and classify disabilities and illnesses and devised experimental treatments. Pellagra was a disease caused by the lack of niacin in diets, dermatitis, dementia, and death. Outbreaks were more common in orphanages and mental hospitals because of lack of meat, milk, eggs, and legumes in their diets. It caused more deaths than any other nutritional-related disease in American history and reached epidemic proportions in the American South in the early 1900s. In 1950, the disease was virtually eliminated from the U.S. because physicians from Bull Street and other asylums were instrumental in diagnosing the cause and the cure. The South Carolina Asylum was the state's primary mental health facility and continued to house a large number of patients. While its goal was moral treatment and cure, it continued to face financial struggles and space constraints most of its years. World War II came and most personnel went to war. Many of the mental health clinics that had opened to assist with outpatient mental illness needs closed until the war ended. The passing of the Public Law 487 in 1946 provided for funds for these clinics. The passing of the Mental Health Act in 1952 provided a mental health commission to oversee all health facilities. But inside the asylum, staff dealt with suicides, patient attacks, and every known disorder known to man. Electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, also known as electroshock therapy, was performed as well as lobotomies. ECT was used to induce a brief seizure through the brain under general anesthesia to treat severe mental health conditions, severe depression, risk of suicide, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. It causes confusion, memory problems, nausea, headaches, and muscle soreness. ECT is still used today if other treatment is not successful. The Bull Street Asylum became a symbol of captivity, horror, and chaos. Most of the patients in the second half of the 20th century were incapable of surviving on their own as they had nowhere to go and no one to take them in and help them. By the 1960s and 70s, anti-psychiatry and civil rights movements, community care initiatives, and Medicaid led to the deinstitutionalization of state hospitals in general and Bull Street in particular. In 1980, President Reagan promised a system of community care that never occurred, so many of the hospitals shut down based on his promises. Bull Street had 6,000 patients in 1969. The last one was released in the 1990s. Even then, budget cuts sometimes forced personnel to strap down patients in 4-point restraints or drug them to control their struggles and mute their cries. In the 1980s and 90s, the deinstitutionalization movement led to its demise. In 2000, few patients remained on Bull Street, and the building sat mostly abandoned and rotting. The Bull Street Asylum disappeared largely due to a combo of these factors: movement toward deinstitutionalization, advancement in antipsychotic meds offering hope for treating mental illness without the need for around-the-clock supervision, a focus on community-based care aimed to provide more individualized and humane treatment in a less restrictive environment, the civil rights movement, no reason for segregation and institutionalization, federal withdrawal of financial support, ethical concerns because these hospitals could be places of abuse and neglect, a shift in treatment philosophy from long-term to short-term inpatient care, outpatient treatment, and community support. Today, 165 of the 181 acres has been sold to private ownership. The Babcock Building is now 208 apartments, which opened in 2023. It is also on the National History Register. The Horger Library, Bennett Auditorium, and most of the Williams Building was demolished. The Ensor Building, built in 1939, a lab and morgue, is now a visual connection between the historic campus and the baseball stadium. There is a James E. Clyburn Golf Center built near the old cemetery. They mounted a net to catch balls from landing where they believe graves remain. The Department of Health and Environmental Control still occupies the Mills Jarrett complex. Retail and event spaces including Segra Park, which is the home to the Columbia Fireflies baseball team. The University of South Carolina Health Sciences campus plans to open a medical school in 2027, focused on treating brain diseases and the nervous system. Ellington Park offers walking trails, a dog park, picnic shelters, water features, and a pond. So what about mental illness today? 1 in 20 U.S. adults experience a serious mental illness each year. Over 19% of adults had anxiety disorder just last year. In South Carolina, 183,000 adults have serious mental illnesses. There are only 3 psychiatric hospitals in South Carolina, but they only deal with addictions. The South Carolina Department of Mental Health operates a network of community mental health centers, clinics, and the 3 psychiatric hospitals. Other organizations offer various support services, resources, and advocacy for individuals with mental illnesses. There are clinics in 46 counties. A 988 suicide and crisis lifeline is available 24/7. With all this said today, the mentally ill population still suffers the results of inadequate funding, virtually no psychiatric hospitals, and overstretched social workers. They still roam the streets as homeless. While progress has been made in understanding and treating mental illness, the situation for individuals with these conditions remains complex and challenging. More people are seeking help because societal attitudes are more accepting, but significant challenges related to accessing that help, affordability by the individual and insurance companies, and the prevalence of mental illness still persist.